Hello, this is Louis Gadima from Appsembler. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar on Open edX XBlocks. We have, of course, Nate Awney, the founder and CEO of Appsembler, but really thrilled to have Ned Batchelder, who's an architect of the Open edX system and has worked a lot with XBlocks, joining us today. So we're going to have Nate go first, who's going to give a bit of a background on XBlocks, and then Ned is going to talk more about the technical side of them. I do want to mention just a couple things before we start. One is that for those of you in the Boston area, we have a meetup on XBlocks coming up on Monday, March 28th. So if you want a deeper dive on them, please join us for that. And we're going to be doing this in about 15 minutes, and then we're going to have another 15 minutes for questions. So please submit your questions in the questions panel of the GoToWebinar interface. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nate, and who will start telling us a bit about XBlocks.
Great. All right. Thanks, Louis. So I'm really thrilled to have Ned joining us today. Ned and I used to work together at edX, and he's a real legendary guy in the Python community and has been doing amazing things at edX. So we're really happy to have him on the call today, and we're really happy to see so many people joining us. So today, here's kind of a rough breakdown of the agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about Appsembler and who we are. For those of you who don't know what Open edX is, I'll just briefly talk about that. We'll talk about what are XBlocks, some examples of XBlocks, where to find more XBlocks, and then Ned's going to do a presentation on the technical architecture of XBlocks, and then we're going to open it up to questions. Okay, so who is Appsembler? We are a leading Open edX solutions provider, which means that we provide customization, implementation, hosting, and support around the Open edX platform. We are headquartered in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just down the road from edX, which means that we get to participate in half days and receive referrals from edX, which is great. Some of our customers are Microsoft, MIT Sloan, Penn State University, Financial Times. So what is Open edX? So Open edX platform is a free and open source course management system that is used to author and deliver online courses. And it's used all over the world to host what are called MOOCs, Massive Open Online Courses, and SPOCs, which is small private online courses. And XBlocks are the building block for the Open edX courseware. So what we mean by that is that XBlocks are pluggable components that let you build new navigational and interactive experiences for learners. So if you're looking at the Open edX interface, the yellow portion of this screen is essentially where you could inject an XBlock component. So it doesn't take out over the whole web page. It's just a portion of the page, but it means that you can replace the navigation, you can add discussions, you can do basically anything within this yellow area can be used with an XBlock. So these are some of the XBlocks that ship with Open edX. I'm going to briefly kind of do a whirlwind tour to show you some of these, but at the end of the presentation I'll have a link where you can read more about the XBlocks that I won't have time to show. So this is the JS molecular editor. This is one that we built for Davidson College. Essentially what this lets you do is the student can create a molecule right in the web page, and then they can submit their answer, and then it checks that molecular structure against the correct answer and gives the student feedback if they got it correct. And this is just a JavaScript widget that we embedded inside the edX courseware system. This is another one that we built for MIT, which is the staff graded assignment. This allows a student to upload a file from their computer into edX, and then the instructor can then grade that assignment, upload an annotated file, and add a comment. If you don't want to have an instructor, but you actually want to have your peers grade you, the peer assessment tool that comes with Aura 2, which is the Open Response Assessment, allows students to grade each other. And before they get their grade, they have to grade their peers. So this is a really useful tool if you have a course with 50 or 100,000 students. There's also a problem with an adaptive hint, which gives the student feedback when they get the wrong answer. There are surveys. There are annotations where you can annotate text on the page, and then when the student mouses over that annotated, they can see a comment, and they can reply to that comment as well. Google has created a Google Calendar XBlock, which allows you to embed a Google Calendar right in your edX course. There's also a Google Drive XBlock, which lets you embed Google Docs or Google presentations. This is a Recommender XBlock, which allows students to recommend additional resources related to the course, and then other students can vote those up and down and can add comments. So Opia is a website that allows people to create and share interactive online training experiences called explorations, and these explorations simulate a conversation with a personal tutor, allowing students to learn by doing while receiving targeted feedback. So if you go to opia.org, you can browse through hundreds of these different explorations, and then using the Opia XBlock that edX provides, you can basically embed one of these learning explorations right in your edX site. So here's an example of a musical exercise that is giving the student feedback that they got the note almost right, but they were off by a few notes. So this is a really, really cool feature that edX that now expands the breadth of different kind of learning simulations and learning exercises that you can include with edX. So how do you actually enable these? From your course authoring studio side, you go to advanced settings, and then you basically just add the XBlocks that you want to the advanced modules list, and then that will then enable that as a unit that you can add inside your edX course. So those were some of the ones that are just ship with edX out of the box. There's a whole range of third-party XBlocks which have been contributed by the community. And again, I don't have time to go through all of these, but I just want to highlight a few of them. Again, to add these, we basically have created sort of a mega course on a Dogwood demo server, which I can share with you later, where we've enabled basically all of these XBlocks for experimentation and just to try them out. So this is a 3D model viewer. You can't really see here in the screenshot, but you can actually, with your mouse, you can rotate this in 3 dimensions, which is really cool. This is a animation, where as you move that slider, it will actually animate this diagram. This is a Brightcode video, so if you don't like the built-in edX video player, you can use a video player from another provider. This is an image explorer where you can click on different hotspots on the image, and then a pop-up appears and you can watch a video and get more information about it. This is a course that I took on jazz appreciation, and they integrated this sort of interactive flashcard tool called Srigo via LTI. And LTI is another way of extending the edX platform with additional functionality. And if you go to eduappcenter.com, there are over 200 different LTI components that can be plugged into the edX platform. So again, like Opia, this is another way of extending edX beyond just what the XBlocks provide. Using the LTI XBlock, you can actually pull in components from other systems that are LTI compatible. So where do you find out about all these XBlocks? If you go to bit.ly/XBlocks, that will redirect you to the XBlocks directory, which is maintained by edX on their wiki. And just for fun, I went to GitHub and I just typed in XBlock as a search term, and over 291 repositories were returned. So I think at last count there were about 50 that were mentioned in the directory, but there's 291 that are mentioned on GitHub. So there's some work to do to update that directory. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to Ned to tell you about the technical architecture.
Hi everyone. I'm really glad to be here too. I'm a little embarrassed by all the accolades that Nate and Louie were throwing on top of me there at the beginning. So I'm an architect at edX, and one of the goals that edX as an organization has is not only to provide education to millions of students on the edX.org site, but also to do research into how online education can best be delivered. And one of the things we did early on in building the Open edX platform was we knew that we wanted people to be able to extend the set of components that could go into courseware. And XBlock was the component architecture that we designed to make it possible for anyone with an interesting idea about how they might be able to teach a concept online better, for them to be able to build a component that could do that. So Nate showed you an example of musical content or 3D content. That wouldn't have been possible with the pieces that we had built just to deliver the first 4 or 5 edX courses. By creating a component architecture, we made it possible for people to innovate and experiment with new ways of delivering content. Now, Nate mentioned that the edX XBlock components go into courseware. It's a little bit more than that. Actually, all courseware on the Open edX platform is composed entirely of XBlocks. So one of the XBlocks that Nate didn't show is the HTML XBlock. Something as boring as a simple paragraph of text. If you're going to present it to the students, you do it by using the Open edX Studio to insert an HTML component, which is itself an XBlock. So all of the courseware is entirely constructed of XBlocks. There's a course XBlock at the top, and then section XBlocks and subsection XBlocks, all the way down to the problems and paragraphs and videos. If you're familiar with HTML, it's much the way divs in an HTML page will nest together. There's a div at the top, which is the whole page, and then smaller divs all the way down to the paragraphs. And I've represented that here by these yellow boxes, which form a tree of components as the XBlocks nest together. If we zoom out a little bit, the XBlocks themselves live in what we call a runtime, which is the container for the XBlocks. And what the runtime provides is abstractions of the services and the data that the XBlock needs. And this is one of the key ideas of the XBlock API, which is that the XBlock can say in a very abstract, declarative way what data it needs. So for instance, a video player will need the YouTube ID of the video to display. The HTML XBlock needs the actual HTML content to display. So the XBlock author can say, I need this kind of data. It doesn't say where that data is actually stored. That's up to the runtime. And different runtimes can make different decisions about where the data is actually stored and how to provide it to the XBlock. And similarly with the services, for instance, grading services, event publication services, and translation services is all abstracted away. The idea being that you as an XBlock author want to focus on your pedagogical concerns, and we as the systems provider want to have the flexibility to deliver the system to you in the way that will work best, either for 1,000 students or for 10 million students. So the Open edX LMS is itself an XBlock runtime. That's why the XBlocks will appear in courses when they're being delivered to students. The LMS provides user registration and progress tracking and grading. Those are the kinds of services the XBlock gets. And then it also provides the data storage. And if you know a little bit about Open edX, you know that we have 2 databases. The courseware content itself is stored in MongoDB. The student data is stored in MySQL. That difference between those 2 databases is abstracted away from you. So you don't have to worry about that as an XBlock author. All you have to know is that you can ask the XBlock runtime for data, and it gets it back for you. Of course, the LMS provides many more services than just the XBlock runtime, but the key thing as an XBlock author is to know that your XBlock lives in the runtime in a way that supports it and removes some of those details from your plate. We'll take care of those details. The Studio is itself an XBlock runtime, so when you're creating the course, you're also using XBlocks to see the editing view of things. So whereas the video player, when showing to a student, will just display the video, when you're editing the video in Studio, you have a chance to change what video ID it is. And again, this is a separate runtime which makes separate decisions about where the data is going to go. So diving in just a little bit deeper, very specifically, what is an XBlock actually? So an XBlock is a Python package that is authored in the same way that any Python package is. It gets installed and then run on your server, your Open edX server. Inside that package is a Python class that provides the declarations of the data fields. It provides methods for presenting information. So the way your content is displayed to the student is that a view method is called, and your Python code can produce any HTML and CSS and JavaScript it needs to in order to appear on the page. And then you can also write Python handlers, which are functions that can get that can react to user input so that your components can be interactive. The idea being here that what you're building as an XBlock is a web application using standard skills, HTML, JavaScript, but only one div at a time. So you're not going to be an entire web app page. You're going to be one div on the page, and the runtime is going to take care of aggregating together all of the XBlocks that appear on one web page and making them all fit together and present them to the user. So you might be wondering, this sounds a lot like LTI. LTI is a way of building components that can go into learning management systems. It is similar in that regard, but the details get very different. XBlock runs in process in the Python application, the OpenEdX Python application, whereas LTI is hosted somewhere else. And the key concepts here are that XBlock has a very tight integration with its runtime, whereas LTI has a very distant relationship to the LMS that it's being hosted in. XBlocks are written in Python because they're going to run inside the LMS. At least they are today. We're working on ways of making them remotable and authorable in other languages. LTI can be written in any language. XBlock has very tight integration with its runtime, whereas LTI is a very loose coupling. XBlock is supported by OpenEdX. LTI is a widely adopted standard. So there's some pros and cons on both sides of the fence here. So XBlocks are a very good way to build a really tightly integrated experience inside an OpenEdX platform. Another thing to know about XBlocks is that you do not need our permission to create XBlocks. You don't need our permission to run XBlocks on your OpenEdX server. You can create them using the tools we've given you. You can install them into your OpenEdX instances and run them as you wish. If you want to get an XBlock running on edX.org, then you would need to talk to us because you need to get your code installed into our servers. But there are 200 OpenEdX instances around the world. Only one of them is edX.org. So there's lots of places to run XBlocks and get them in front of students. That's all I've got on the technical details. I'll be glad to answer questions.
All right, great. Thank you, Nate. Thank you, Ned. We do have a few questions. So the first one that I have, are all the publicly available XBlocks free, or are some of them being charged for? Do you know, Ned?
That's a good question. I'm not. So one thing I didn't touch on here is the licensing model. So OpenEdX, the OpenEdX platform, for the most part, is licensed under the AGPL, which requires that modifications you make to the platform be themselves open sourced. It doesn't mean you can't charge for things, but you do have to make your source code available. But our extension APIs, like XBlock, are typically licensed under the Apache license, which is a more liberal license. And that means that you can author an XBlock and keep the code secret if you want, either because you think it gives you a competitive advantage in the marketplace or you're trying to charge for it. I don't know of anyone who's charged for an XBlock, but I do know there are XBlocks that are private to certain adopters of OpenEdX.
Okay.
I think from that directory there were there was not a single XBlock that I could determine that was a commercial XBlock. They were all freely available. That being said, some of those XBlocks depend on an external service. For example, Brightcode and Uyala, which are video hosting XBlocks, depend on having a Brightcode subscription to host your videos. So while the XBlock itself may be free, the service that works with that XBlock, there may be a fee for that.
Right.
And let me remind people, you can submit more questions in the question panel of the GoToWebinar control panel. So here's a question. Do XBlocks work in all successive releases? If you created one for Cypress, does it work in Dogwood, and will they work forever?
Right. So we take the API aspect of the XBlocks really seriously for a couple of reasons. One is that the whole point is to make it possible to extend the platform, and if we're going to pull the rug out from under extenders, that's not a great way to make people happy. But the other thing is, because all of the content in any OpenEdX course is XBlocks, we have our own developers who are building XBlocks in order to make edX.org features work. So there are a lot of people, including our own engineers, who are building on the XBlock API. We have not broken compatibility and we intend not to. I can't promise that we won't. We may have a great feature that's going to only be available in XBlock 2.0 whenever that happens. But we do take the API compatibility very seriously. So XBlocks that have been deployed into the first OpenEdX release, Aspen, will still work in the latest one, Dogwood.
Okay. What happens if there's a bug in an XBlock?
What happens if there's a bug in any piece of software you've adopted and installed on your server? You'd need to talk to the author of that XBlock.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll just mention here too that one of the things that we try to do for our customers is to vet XBlocks before they're installed on the server. So if there is an XBlock that's maybe half-baked, or it's no longer maintained, or it might be destructive in some way, we serve as kind of a safeguard for our customers to protect them from issues like that. And we also, another reason that we vet the XBlocks is because we're making a commitment. If we install it for our customer, we're making a commitment to maintain that moving forward into the future. So that's one difference between kind of doing a DIY install of OpenEdX, which of course anyone can do that, but the downside of doing that is then you're now responsible for sort of vetting all of those XBlocks and maintaining them over time, whereas that's a service that we provide for our customers.
Yeah, one of the things we're trying hard to encourage is an ecosystem of service providers and adopters and extenders of the OpenEdX platform. One of the advantages to that is you get a lot of energy from different places, right? So Appsembler can do a lot of work and provide a great service. You could decide instead that you had the technical skills and you wanted to do it yourself. There are other service providers. You could come to edX.org and talk about partnerships with us for getting courses on our site, which is a little more difficult. The downside, of course, is that you can't just go to one place, edX.org, and say, I will give you money and you will give me a product. It's not that simple. There's a lot of people involved that can be doing things, and you have to navigate that landscape and find the right people to work with and the right software to choose.
Okay, so this is one question just on the basic idea of XBlocks, and someone says, it's XBlock basically like a plugin for WordPress?
Yeah, that's a very a common analogy, in that WordPress provides the basic framework for, I guess it's not just blogs these days, but it started as a framework for blogs, and then plugins have basically cracked the whole thing open and let you change pretty much anything you want. XBlocks is a little bit different than that, in that, as Nate showed in the first slide, there are parts of the screen that are the content of the course, and that's all XBlocks, and there are other parts of the screen that XBlocks can't touch, or at least can't touch yet. One of the things we'd like to do is use XBlocks in more and more places in the LMS, even outside the courseware. For instance, the instructor dashboard, people often want to add information to the instructor dashboard. If we could give them a way to write an XBlock that then would be hosted on the dashboard, that would be a great way to leverage that API even more. It's not possible just yet. But so WordPress plugins have a bit more control over what appears on the screen than an OpenEdX XBlock does. You can't completely change the look of the LMS using just XBlocks.
So right now, XBlocks are only used within the actual courseware.
Right.
Okay.
Right. That's where they started, but it was an interesting process when we were designing the API to realize that when we got to the end of designing what an XBlock was, that it had nothing to do with courses necessarily at all. It's really just a web application for one small part of the screen, and we're using it in the courseware. So it's certainly possible that in the future we'll expand the places where XBlocks can appear in the LMS, but for now it's just within the courseware.
What about talk a little bit about asides, Ned? Because I understand that's something that Kale mentioned at the last conference that was being worked on.
Yeah, so asides are a feature of XBlocks that are not yet finished. The idea of an aside, I've never quite liked that name, to be honest. I like sidecar better. The idea of an aside is that you may want to add a feature into courseware that doesn't appear at one particular place in the course, but is spread over all of the courseware. So all the XBlocks that we've seen so far, the way you use them is you look at the outline of your course and you think to yourself, right here I would like a video, and you put a video XBlock right there. But for instance, you might want to say, throughout my entire course I'd like to have Facebook like buttons on everything. Well, you're not going to go through Studio and add a like XBlock to every single point in your course. What you'd like to say is, in this course, everywhere there is an XBlock, also add a like button alongside it. Or, I would like you to tag everything in my course, or something, right? There's lots of things you might imagine wanting to do where you would have one idea that's spread across everything. That's what an aside is for. It would be a new kind of component that you could author and then install across everything, and it would appear on all of your XBlocks. It's not done yet, but that's an example of the way we're extending the XBlock concepts in order to support more educational ideas.
Okay, we have time for just, I think, maybe 2 more questions. And when we finish, or when people leave the webinar, there is just a very short 2-question survey, so we would really appreciate it if you would answer those 2 questions. So question here about security. What are the issues around the security of XBlocks? Who vets it? What about integration with authentication and so forth?
Right, so XBlocks run in the same process as the LMS. So we have to, whoever runs the XBlock has to be certain that they trust the author of the XBlock to have written the component properly. So for edX.org, that means that our engineers will review the code of the XBlock before we'll install it on edX.org. As Nate has mentioned, they vet XBlocks, Appsembler vets XBlocks for their customers to make sure that the code they're running is going to be secure. Authentication doesn't really enter into it because you're already running inside the LMS as an authenticated user. So there is one of those little green boxes, the services that's available to the XBlock is a user information service. Who am I running as? And by the time the XBlock starts running, all of that authentication has already been covered. OpenEdX supports a number of third-party authentication, single sign-on techniques. Those are all outside the scope of XBlock. That's one of those details that's been abstracted away from you as the author of a courseware component.
Okay. So one more question then. What about are XBlocks responsive? How do they relate to the mobile apps?
To the mobile apps. So the mobile app supports XBlocks. I'm a little unclear on exactly how they do that, but the mobile apps, if you were keeping up with them, originally were just for showing the videos in the course. But now they support all of the assessment types as well, which means supporting XBlocks because the assessments themselves are XBlocks.
Okay, and are they responsive?
I don't know.
Okay.
I should know that. I don't.
Some of them are. Some of them are responsive, but not all the XBlocks are responsive yet.
All right, so it depends on how they were coded. All right, well, thank you very much, Ned, for joining us today.
Sure, no problem.
Nate, hope that this was very helpful for everyone. And as I said, please do answer the survey on the way out the door, and we'll be sending out a link and the recording of this, including the PowerPoint presentations, will be available online. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.